There's a version of the solopreneur story almost no one admits to publicly, even when they're living it privately. The version where you chose independence because you genuinely believed you were someone who didn't need the structures everyone else needed. And now, 2 or 3 years in, you're not sure anymore. Not sure if you were right, not sure if needing something is the same thing as having been wrong, and not sure what it means about you if the answer turns out to be yes. That specific uncertainty, that private, unspoken version of the doubt is exactly what this video is about. Not to confirm the doubt, not to dismiss it, but to give it the honest examination it deserves. Because there's a myth at the center of the solopreneur identity that most people absorbed so early and so completely that it stopped feeling like a belief and started feeling like a fact. And that myth, the one about self-sufficiency, about the operator who needs nothing and nobody, is doing something very specific to the people who believe it most deeply. Here's what this video is going to do. It's going to trace where that myth actually came from. It's going to name exactly what it costs. And it's going to offer a more accurate version of independence, one that doesn't ask you to become someone else, but does ask you to stop letting an incomplete story govern you. Start with this. The self-sufficiency myth didn't come from solopreneurs. Solopreneurs didn't sit down one day and collectively decide that needing support was weakness. That story was handed to them, fully formed, emotionally compelling, and commercially useful to the people handing it over. Here's where it actually came from. The entrepreneurship content industry, the books, the podcasts, the courses, the personal brand ecosystem, was built on a very specific hero narrative. The lone founder, the self-made operator, the one who figured it out alone. That narrative sold. It sold because it resonated with something real, the genuine desire for autonomy, for ownership, for a path that belongs to you. But the narrative was curated. The stories that got amplified were the ones about solitary triumph. The stories that got quietly edited out were the ones about the mentor who changed everything, the peer who caught the fatal flaw in the business model, the thinking partner who kept the founder from making the call that would have ended it. Those stories existed. They just didn't fit the frame. And the frame got repeated often enough, across enough platforms and enough formats by enough voices the audience trusted, that it stopped being a frame and became the furniture of the mind. Here's the part that matters specifically for you. This myth wasn't broadcast randomly. It was aimed deliberately or not at a very specific kind of person, the independent-minded one. The one who already suspected they were capable of doing this differently. The one who was, frankly, already primed to believe it because it matched something they genuinely felt about themselves. The myth landed in you so completely, not because you were naive, because it was close enough to true. You are capable of operating independently. You do think differently from people who need constant external structure. That part wasn't a lie. The lie was the implication that followed. That capability means needing nothing. That independence means self-contained. That the destination of this path is an operator who has engineered out the need for other minds entirely. That part was added. That part was the mythology. And it's that specific addition, not the real thing beneath it, that has been governing you. Now here's the mechanism. Because knowing where the myth came from isn't enough if you can't see what it's doing in real time. The internalized myth doesn't just sit there as a belief. It functions as a governor, a background system that fires every time you feel something that contradicts it. You're deep in a decision that matters. You feel the pull toward talking it through with someone. The governor fires. You shouldn't need that. You put the phone down. You go back to the pro-con list. You make the call alone. And you spend the next 3 days second-guessing something you could have thought through clearly in 40 minutes with the right person. That's not a discipline problem. That's not an overthinking problem. That's not a personal observation. That's structural. That's what happens when a governing belief and a real human need come into direct, repeated conflict. And the belief wins every time. And here's what that costs over time. Decision quality degrades. Not because capability declined, but because the thinking never gets the external friction that sharpens it. Your working assumptions never get challenged. Your risk calibration never gets tested. And the confidence you feel in a decision made alone is a very poor proxy for whether the decision is actually good. Creative output narrows. Ideas that need collision with another perspective to become what they're capable of being stay in the form they arrived in. Slightly underdeveloped, slightly less than what they could have been. And underneath both of those, quieter and more corrosive, the growing suspicion that your judgment isn't what it used to be. That the thinking has gotten subtly worse. That you're circling the same problems in smaller and smaller loops. Research on distributed cognition, on how humans actually process complex decisions, is consistent on this point. Judgment is not a solo function. It evolved as a social process. Running it entirely alone, over years, produces measurable drift. None of that is a verdict on your capability. Every single part of it is a predictable consequence of operating under a myth that told you to run a social cognitive process as a solo one, and to feel ashamed every time you wanted to do it differently. So here's the reframe. And this is the part worth sitting with. The myth told you that self-sufficiency was the destination, that the fully realized independent operator was the one who had engineered out the need for other minds. That framing was backwards. Self-sufficiency isn't the ceiling of this path. It's the floor, it's the entry condition, the baseline capability that makes the solo path possible to begin. What you build from there, how you operate, how you think, what structures you choose and refuse. That's where the real work of the path happens. Here's what high-functioning solo operators actually do. Not the ones who perform independence for an audience, but the ones who sustain it for a decade and build something real. They build support, deliberately, selectively, without surrendering autonomy. They have one or two people who understand the stakes well enough to give honest input before the call goes out. They have a thinking partner relationship, formal or informal, where the thinking gets friction without the thinker losing ownership of the outcome. They didn't do this because they were weak. They did it because they were operating intelligently, because they understood something the myth never taught, that independence is a direction, not a destination. And sustaining it requires the same kind of deliberate infrastructure as anything else you've built. Here's the honest version of this. The solopreneur who has been on this path long enough to feel the specific weight of carrying every decision alone, the uncelebrated win, the unconfirmed call, the slow drift of confidence in their own judgment. That person isn't someone who failed at independence. That person is someone who has been doing it long enough to know what it actually asks. And what it actually asks is not less support. It's better support. The right kind. On your terms. The struggle wasn't evidence against the choice. It was evidence of what the choice costs when it's run on an incomplete map. And that distinction between I am failing this path and I have been navigating with a map that was missing a layer is not a small one. That distinction changes something real. If this video opens something you want to go further with, not just the idea, but the actual process of separating who you are from the myth you absorbed, there's a resource in the description built exactly for that. It's a 7-day guided program designed specifically to help solo operators rebuild the internal confidence that doesn't depend on performing a version of independence they were sold rather than chose. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Now here's the objection this video knows you're holding. If I accept that I need people, if I admit that the self-sufficiency story was incomplete, doesn't that mean the whole independence project was built on something false? And if it was, who am I without it? That's the right question. And it deserves a real answer. No, it doesn't mean the project was built on a lie. The foundation was real. The desire for autonomy, for ownership, for work that belongs to you and no one else. That wasn't the myth. That was you. The myth was the frame around it. The part that said the purest expression of that desire was an operator who needed nothing. Removing the frame doesn't touch the foundation. It just gives you room to build something that actually holds. So here's the first move. Not a system. Not a program. One question. The next time you feel the pull toward support, toward talking something through, toward wanting someone who understands the stakes to weigh in before you decide, and the governor fires, and the old script runs, ask this instead. Is this my judgment? Or is this the myth? That's it. That's the whole move. Because you can't interrupt a governor you can't see. But the moment you can name it as a cultural inheritance rather than a discovered truth, the moment you can look at the shame response and say, I know where you came from, and you were built for someone else's purposes, it loses some of its authority. Not all of it, not immediately, but some. And some is enough to start. What high-functioning solo operators actually do isn't that they never feel the pull of the myth. They feel it. They've just practiced asking that question long enough that the myth doesn't always win. And over time, this is the part the myth never told you. The asking gets easier, not because the need for independence disappears, because the identity gets large enough to hold both. I built this alone, and I built it well. And part of building it well was knowing when to think alongside someone. Those two things are not in conflict. They were only in conflict inside the myth. If this opens something that feels worth going deeper on, the resource in the description is built specifically for that next step. The structured process of building the identity that comes after the myth. What's one moment when you felt the pull towards support and the myth fired back? What did you do with it? Here's what the doubt was actually telling you. Not that you were wrong to start. Not that independence was the wrong choice. Not that the struggle is evidence of a capability you don't have. The doubt was telling you that you've been operating on a map that was missing a layer, and that the missing layer isn't a departure from who you are. It's the part of who you are that the myth told you to ignore. The self-sufficiency story was never entirely false. The most capable, most independent operators genuinely are different from people who need constant external structure. That part was real. That part is you. But capability was never the same thing as needing nothing, and independence was never the same thing as operating alone on every dimension of the work for the entire length of the path, without ever building the thinking partner structures that make the path sustainable. Going solo wasn't a mistake. The difficulty isn't evidence against the choice. It's evidence of what the choice actually asks. And what it asks, the honest version, the complete version, is not less support. It's the right support, chosen deliberately, structured to fit the way you've chosen to work, without requiring you to become someone else or perform a version of independence you were sold rather than built. The next time the governor fires, the next time you feel the pull toward a thinking partner and the old script tells you that needing that means you weren't built for this, ask the question, is this my judgment? Or is this the myth? The solopreneurs who stay on this path and build something real aren't the ones who needed less. They're the ones who eventually stopped letting an incomplete story decide what strength was allowed to look like. That's the work. And the fact that you're still here, still asking, still building, still willing to examine the story you were handed, means you already know it's worth doing. One move at a time.